A verbal representation tends to be the hardest way for us to figure out what a function is. And so one of the things we really want to make sure that we do is look for the words is a function of. This really cues us into where the input is and what the output is. So is a function of, we know that the input is always after this, and what's before these words is always the output. So if you recall from our definition of function notation, it's always the output is a function of the input. So when we're reading these, we can see which one is the input and the output. And so it's really beneficial to highlight the input in one color and then highlight the output in some other color. So in this case, the amount of the paycheck is your output and the hours you work is your input. And so it says to identify these and assign appropriate variables. So we can say that the input is H equals the number of hours worked. And again, I'm writing this in ordered pair because then that clearly tells us which one is our input and which one is our output. And the amount of our paycheck, we can easily use A or P. I'm going to use P here, is the amount of paycheck. And we have to make sure we give it units, which is the amount of paycheck in dollars. So we've done part A, which is to identify the input and output and using appropriate variables. And now we need to determine whether or not this is a function. And so thinking back, for every hour that's worked, or some value of an hour, that input quantity, am I going to have a unique paycheck amount? And if I work 3 hours, and because I know that I'm working $12.50 per hour, 3 hours is going to give me a specific value. 5 hours is going to give me a different specific value. If I work 3 hours, I'm not going to get 2 different answers. So yes, the number of hours yields a specific paycheck amount, or you could also say the paycheck amount is specific to the number of hours worked. Either way would be sufficient. So yes, the hours worked has only one specific dollar amount. Okay, and then the last part is, since it says write in function notation, if it's a function, since we said yes, it's a function, so now we want to write this in function notation. And so we have H and P, and so the output variable is always a function of the input variable. So H being inside the parentheses because it's our input, and P is going to be outside our parentheses because it's the output variable. The last way that we represent functions is by an algebraic representation. And so we can kind of do this in two different ways. We can have a symbolic rule or the function notation. And remember, we use function notation anytime we know that the situation is defined as a function. So if we just look at this, C equals 2.05 times G, and C of G equals 2.05 G. So this is telling us that this is now a function and that G is our input variable, C is our output variable. And if you recall from covariation, everything that's happening in the unit of G, some relationship is happening at the same time with C. We don't know what C and G represent, and it doesn't really matter at this point. We're just representing that this situation is a function by writing it in function notation. So if we were to define what the meaning of this is, this would mean that we could either state this as a question: what is the value of C when the input is 14.7? Okay, it's not asking us to evaluate, it's just asking us for meaning. So you're not calculating anything here, there's no computation. So it's just asking, what does this mean? So we can write it again as this question, or we can say the value of C when. You can actually write it as a statement. So you can say the value of C when G is 14.7. Okay, now here we're actually asking to evaluate. So we're going to evaluate and then write the ordered pair based on that. So we know that here's our symbolic rule, here's our function. So we know that P of 0, so it's saying whenever I have y is 0, I'm going to replace the y with 0, so 37.98 times 0.97 raised to the 0 power. And if I type this into my calculator, I'll end up with 37.98. And so it's asking us to write it as an order pair. My input value is 0. My output value is 37.98.